各位朋友，晚上好！欢迎您观看服务器艺术、当代影像、路径及其可能第15期线上论坛。我们非常荣幸地邀请到国际著名策展人、作家、图书编辑和教育家大卫·坎帕尼、摄影评论家、摄影家、策展人姜荣、艺术理论家臧策、青年学者陈国森，围绕如何读懂一幅摄影作品展开分享和讨论。本次线上论坛由摄影师、电影工作者、巴德学院摄影系校友夏静怡担任翻译，在此表示感谢。接下来有请主持人、艺术理论家臧策老师。
大家好，我是今天的主持人臧策，欢迎大家来到服务器艺术、当代影像、路径及其可能第15期。我们今天呢非常荣幸地邀请到了国际的著名策展人、作家、图书编辑和教育家大卫·坎帕尼先生，为我们做这个主题的分享。今天的主题是如何读懂一幅摄影作品。这个主题，我相信呢，国内的摄影界的朋友一定都是非常之关心的。因为什么呢？因为这个中国摄影界这些个摄影师以及摄影爱好者非常非常关注的一个问题，就是如何能够看懂一幅这个摄影作品，或者说我们简单的讲，我们如何能看懂当代艺术照片。那么这个我还清楚的记得，2017年的时候，丽水摄影节结束之后，在中国摄影界发生了一场非常非常激烈的论战，就是说这个看不懂照片，我们应该怎么办？对，所以呢，这个当时呢还是这个讨论的非常的热烈，当时我也加入了这个讨论啊，当时糊涂写了一篇文章，对，也引起了非常大的反响。我也写了一篇文章，叫“看不懂怎么办”。对，所以“看不懂”这个词，在我们中国摄影界，实际这个词已经是可以加双引号了，可以成为一个典故。所以呢，对，大卫·坎帕尼先生。大家可能对他最了解的就是，姜荣先生为他翻译的一本非常重要的一本著作，叫什么呢？叫《论照片》。这本书呢，我当时还写了一段这个推荐语，我们这个摄影界的朋友都很熟悉。那么今天呢，我们把这个坎帕尼先生请到了我们这个直播间，来跟大家再一次的这个来分享。如何来看懂一幅当代摄影艺术的作品？对，所以呢，今天这个讨论的主题应该呢是非常非常的这个关键，对中国摄影界来讲是非常非常重要的一个话题。那么，大卫·坎帕尼先生呢，在英国的这个威斯敏斯特大学现在是任教，同时担任呢这个 ICP 艺术总监。他曾经获得过呢 ICP 摄影写作的无极奖、克劳斯图书奖和这个英国皇家的摄影学会奖。他呢这个最新出版的论照片，这个我那个刚才已经介绍了。对，他在这本书的序言里指出呢，说这本书与其说是我对照片的看法，不如说是我们如何思考它们；与其说是关于摄影师的意图，不如说是我们看照片时发生的事情。而且照片没有错误与正确的解释，那么我们应该如何读懂一幅摄影作品呢？对，所以今天呢，我也会在今天的讨论里头呢，分享我自己这些年的一个观点，就是说，一个照片它是一个视觉艺术的作品。那么一个视觉呢，它通向了不同的维度，既通向了这个语义的维度，但它其实还通向了什么呢？我们身体的空间以及我们身体的这种行动。一个用语言来解读照片，语言本身它只是其中的一个维度，它能不能够完整的替代一个照片的这个来彻底的解释一个照片呢？在这点上，我可能跟坎帕尼先生呢有一个这个非常共同的想法。我们认为，对这个语言可能只是赋予这个照片的意义的，这样的一种方式。但是照片真的是需要看，而不是一个说用语言只能是它一个作为进入它的一个 指示性的一个导向性的东西，而不可能全部的来为这个照片用语言来替代。如果那样的话呢，我们就不需要看照片，我们只需要读一段文字就够了。对，所以这也是回头我们稍后会分享。那么今天呢，我们非常的荣幸的将与论照片的这本书的译者，也是著名的策展人和批评家，也是摄影师姜蓉老师，也是我们的老朋友。往次的咱们这个节目里，姜蓉老师呢都是这个非常重要的一个这个分享者和这个语坛嘉宾。以及呢，这个前几次也是在我们这里做客的陈国深老师，他们会呢，这个从不同的角度向坎帕尼呢提出相关的问题和看法。对这个，然后与我们在线收看我们这个直播的朋友们，进行互动，对，促使我们如何用自己的眼光，用艺术史和摄影理论的这个知识背景，来这个更深刻的来理解这个作为当代艺术的这样的一种影像，在今天我们应该如何理解和观看它。好的，那么这个下面呢，我们就有请坎帕尼先生，先进行他的一个主题分享。好，有请坎帕尼先生。
Great. Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. Good morning or evening, whatever time it is there. It was mentioned in the introduction that I teach at the University of Westminster, and I was there for quite a long time, maybe around 18 years. So I was very involved with introducing young students, undergrad students, to many different kinds of photography and different ways of thinking about it. And I'm now the creative director at the International Center of Photography in New York, which has a very important exhibition program, but it also has a school of photography, the school was established in 1977, and the ICP itself was established in 1974. So we're talking about an institution that's around 50 years old. It's very unusual to have an exhibitions program and a school together all in the same building. And part of the reason that I joined ICP was that I have always been involved in education and exhibition making, as well as writing and publishing. I think I've just written book number 37. I try to do, if I can, two books a year, and I try to make them all different, just so I don't get bored. There are many different ways of making books about photography and many different ways of writing about it. And then there's many different ways of actually making a book, just in terms of its graphic design or its visual approach. But yes, as was mentioned in the introduction, I made a book which Ron kindly translated, called On Photographs. And I will really concentrate on this book because it was a particular challenge around this idea of what it means to understand a photograph. That's the cover you might be familiar with. The starting point really was the British publisher Thames and Hudson asked me for a quite classical looking book about my favorite pictures, but I thought that was very indulgent. I didn't want to do that. But I liked the very classical format of certain kinds of photography books where you have an image on the right hand side and a short text, maybe 500 words on the left. That format actually goes right back to almost to the beginnings of photography. The British inventor William Henry Fox Talbot made a publication called The Pencil of Nature, which really took that form. 24 photographs, each with a text. And I wanted to call the book on photographs, not on photography. Firstly, because Susan Sontag had famously written a book called On Photography. But I was really trying to think about the specifics of very particular pictures, rather than thinking about photography as a more abstract or universal category. I think there is a difference between photography and photographs, just as a way of thinking. I'll just show you briefly what the book looks like, and that itself might give you a little bit of a sense of where I was coming from. They are not all art photographs by any means. Some are commercial pictures, some are scientific pictures, anonymous snapshots. There are famous things, but they're not always maybe the most obvious examples. Okay, well, one of the things I was interested in was the fact that very often books about photography try to be authoritative. They try to tell the viewer what they should be thinking, which photographs are important. And I'm quite resistant to that, partly because I'm an image maker myself, but also I'm not very comfortable writing as an authority. I'd rather write and think as someone who is simply interested, the way I assume viewers are interested. So it was important to me in this book that there was a range of different kinds of work, and that the way the writing proceeded was in an anti-authoritative way. And it was more interested, the book is more interested in asking questions than telling people or instructing people. I was certainly not interested in instructing people, quote, how to understand a photograph. I find that idea, how to understand a photograph, a little bit puzzling, a little bit nonsensical. If you think about it, we all look at photographs, and so they mean whatever they mean to us. There's not a secret way of understanding them. However, I do have a background in psychoanalysis. And what psychoanalysis tells us is that a lot of our understanding of the world is either a misunderstanding or it's very unconscious. We're not always aware of our own thinking. So the book is really more interested in maybe slowing down, the reader. And what happens when you slow down the looking at photographs is that they become strange. And the reason they become strange has two parts to it. One is most of our experience of photographs here, we are a quarter of a way through the 21st century. Most of our experience is very rapid. And we're not expected to look at images for very long. We're supposed to look at them and move on quickly. And so slowing things down is going to introduce a certain kind of strangeness. And I'm kind of interested in making the viewer comfortable with with their own strangeness, with their own feeling that if you do look at one photograph seriously for a long time, it will actually become more ambiguous, less obvious, perhaps. And secondly, most photographs are not really made as individual photographs. Most photography comes to us as a body of work, a project, a theme, a series, an album, an archive. So there's always another photograph around that's ready to take our attention. Certainly very few art photographers make single photographs. Most of the time they're making a body of work. So there seems to be an understanding that we look at a photograph and then we quickly look at another one. So there's this very interesting, it's not a problem, it's just a fact of our visual culture that images are, generally speaking, not to be looked at for very long, and then they're always made as, you know, bodies of work. So looking at individual photographs, you know, it's very pleasurable, it's very interesting, but it's slightly outside of how most photographs are experienced. Nothing wrong with that. It's important that we do something else. Something else that's interesting about this kind of format of book, and as I said, I'm not the first to make a book with this very classical layout and concept with a photograph on one side and a text on the other. But I was interested in actually sequencing the pictures. So if you will notice that there are connections from one picture to the next and the next here. Sometimes a kind of thematic, sometimes a kind of formal connection. That's just something I've always been interested in doing. And in fact, I think for over a year before I did any writing, I wasn't just selecting the pictures for this book, I was actually arranging the sequence of them. And that meant that you could open the book anywhere and look at the picture and then read about it or read about the photographer, its context. But you could also read the whole book from start to finish as a slightly winding, wandering, kind of philosophical essay, long essay on what it means to look at photographs. Another little sequence here, just to give you an idea. Sometimes the connections are very obvious, sometimes less so. Great. Okay, you meant Gregory Crutzen was mentioned earlier. I came to photography from an interest in cinema as a child, very young child, maybe 9, 10, 11 years old, really interested in movies. And my family got a home video recorder. This is around 1980, something like that. So I'm showing my age. And what really interested me was the I used to record lots of movies from the TV, was the pause button. The idea that you could stop a movie and it would be a single frame. And of course, when you turn it into a movie into a single frame, certain things become clear. One, visually, the movie is made up of many, many photographs. Two, when you pause a movie, sound and language drop away into silence. And also the narrative, the story falls away, and you're just left with this completely silent fragment. And that itself was my way into understanding something about photography. That its silence is a very distinctive part of it, and so is the fact that it doesn't really tell stories. It can suggest things, but it can't tell a story the way a novel can, or the way a movie can, or a play in a theater can. And I think if we like photography, let's say everybody here likes photography. On some level, that means we must like the fact that it's silent. We must like the fact that it is still, and we must like the fact that it's extracted from story, situation, narrative, and to some extent context. That must be part of the appeal of photography, I would think. But those things are often regarded as problems with photography, that somehow we then have to put back in more information, more ideas in the form of writing or captions under the picture or sequences of pictures in order to overcome the limitations. And that's very understandable if you think about the history of journalism, for example. That was always photojournalism was always a combination of photographs with each other and photographs with writing. And most photojournalistic images don't make much sense if you just look at them on their own, with no other images, no writing, no nothing. I know people often describe Gregory Crewdson work as cinematic, and it's true that this photograph here does feature the Hollywood actress Julianne Moore. I'm very suspicious when people describe photographs as cinematic, because cinema can look like anything. Cinema can look like a documentary photograph. Cinema can look like wild science fiction. It can look like certain kinds of painting. It can look like anything. So when we describe a photograph as cinematic, I'm always a little nervous about that. Not sure it helps us that much. What interested me about this photograph, as opposed to cinema, is that when an audience is watching a film, the movement of let's say the actors or the framing of it and the camera movements tell you where to look. If you imagine an audience in a movie theater with laser beams coming out of their eyes towards the screen, you can imagine the audience is always looking at pretty much the same thing. If for some reason the movie was paused, then everyone's eyes would start to explore the image in a very different way. So I was fascinated by this photograph by Gregory Crewdson and the fact that it had a Hollywood actress in it, but we weren't encouraged to look at the photograph the way we might do if it was a frame from a movie. We could look anywhere. and spend a long time with it, actually got interested in her feet. Funny thing about feet and hands is that they are very important to photographs. Always. You only have to speak to a portrait photographer. Maybe feet are less important in cinema. But it's an interesting question of whether feet can act. You know, when we think of an actor, you know, pretending or, you know, giving a performance, do feet actually do things like that? Well, that might sound like a strange question, but then what's the difference between looking at her face with an expression on it and her feet, which you don't normally get to see or think about? Well, that means lots of different things are going on when we're looking at a photograph like this. We don't have to have a kind of secret training or secret knowledge. This is happening for everyone when they're looking. You know, many different things are happening at the same time. Interestingly, in this book, when you turn the page from the Gregory Crutzen picture, you saw a picture made in the context of French surrealism from 1929 by Jacques-André Boiffard. And it was a photograph of somebody's big toe. And it was commissioned by a surrealist writer called Georges Bataille for one of the surrealist journals. And he was very interested in the feet and toes as something resistant to high culture. We might have great ideas, but our feet are always in the mud. And they're not the most attractive part of us unless you're interested in them. So that I don't really mention the connection between this picture and this one. I mean, I do in the book mention something about feet when I'm discussing this picture. So there's lots of things that are going on in the book that are just little suggestions to the viewer. They're not telling you how to read anything. It's not a book telling you what to think. It's a discussion about how we look at photographs. And in the end, it's viewers that make the meaning. It's not the photograph. And it's not really the photographer either. Only in the sense that the photographer is the first viewer of their own image, let's say. So I'm much more interested in sharing and encouraging viewers to think about their own viewing rather than be told how they should look or what something means. I think those are slightly ridiculous questions in a way. Some approaches I take in the book introduce an element of history and social history, cultural history. This is a photograph by Ruth Orkin, American girl in Italy. It's kind of quite a famous picture, certainly in America. And we can all look and we can all see that there's a woman walking down the street and everyone else on the street is a man, and there's some kind of situation going on. Maybe they're looking at her, maybe she's uncomfortable, we don't really know. I got very interested in this photograph because it has become a famous picture. And I think it really became a famous picture within the broad context of feminism and thinking about the power, social power of men, and the way the way we look at the world and each other is structured by power and gender quite often. But what was interesting is when I went back to the source, the photograph first appeared in a piece in Cosmopolitan magazine, American magazine, about traveling alone in Europe. And it becomes clear that all the photographs are a kind of staged collaboration between Ruth Orkin and a woman she met who was staying in the same hotel. And they went out together and they made these photographs about exploring a city, European city, on your own and really enjoying it. There's nothing in Cosmopolitan about feminism, about being looked at by men on the street or anything like that. It's much more a kind of encouragement to explore the city on your own. So it's interesting that the photograph doesn't have no photograph has a fixed meaning. Meaning is often dependent on the cultural context and the historical context. And the meaning of this photograph has clearly changed over time, certainly for audiences in the US and Europe. I think I first encountered it in a lecture about feminism and photography. So I was quite surprised to go back and find in Cosmopolitan magazine that that's not really, well, it's still about the kind of empowerment of women, we can say that, but it's not a kind of critique of the male gaze, let's call it. Certainly wasn't at that point in 1952. So that's interesting. You know, we could ask ourselves, what would we think of this picture if we were transported back to 1952? It's also nice to know that the photograph was a staged photograph in a way and a documentary photograph. They knew what they were doing, the photographer and the woman in the picture. They weren't arranging everyone else. And in fact, they took two different shots of it. So sometimes there's a lot to learn about a photograph by going back and kind of tracing its history. It's a nice thing to do. You saw this photograph earlier by Helena Almeida, inhabited painting, as if she's painting from behind the surface of the photograph onto the surface. Now, the surface of a photograph is in a way an imaginary thing. A photograph doesn't really have the surface the way a painting would have a surface. You know, brushstrokes, marks. There's a kind of industrial smoothness to photography. So we have to think about the illusionism of photography. It's not that we feel we can reach into the picture when we look at a photograph, but neither do we ever think of it as completely flat either. It's a little bit of both. And certainly Almeida's series she made a number of these called inhabited painting. They did interest me because of this attention that she draws to surface and the different kinds of surface of a painting and different kinds of surface of a photograph. And in fact, you're now looking at this on a screen, and in the book you're looking at it as a reproduction. If you were to actually look at Almeida's work, you would see and be able to feel, if you were allowed to touch it, the paint on the surface. And in fact, I say to the viewer in the book, if you run your finger across the surface of this picture, it will feel no different to any of the others in the book. So I'm always trying to remind the viewer that they're looking at reproductions. That is a strange thing to ask a viewer to think about, because photographs seem to belong wherever we put them. When you look at a photographic image in a book, you don't think to yourself, okay, where is the real thing? Where's the real object? A photograph somehow is its reproduction. If you see a painting reproduced in a book, you know the painting is somewhere else. It's in a museum, or it's in someone's home, or someone's studio. You see a photograph on a billboard, or on a T-shirt, or on a gallery wall, or on the page of a book, and it seems to belong wherever you put it. It's like a, chameleon, that kind of reptile that sort of changes color wherever it's whatever its background is. Somehow it's a little bit like that. Photographs just seem to fit into the world. That's a very obvious point to make about the difference between painting and photography, but it's worthwhile making. I think viewers are sometimes what you're doing as a writer is making people aware of the fact that they are already aware of something, or they're experiencing it, but they haven't quite made it conscious yet. So often I'm trying to say very, very obvious things that just help people think about their own thinking, not telling them what to think, but just help people think about their own thinking. With an image like this, taken by Evelyn Hofer, a German photographer who came to America, she's mainly known for her portraits, large format, very slow photography made on a tripod. My text here is mainly biographical. It kind of tells the career story of Evelyn Hofer. That's a very classical way to write in a book like this. But actually, what was really on my mind was I wanted to have this last paragraph, which is just 2 or 3 sentences, which says, okay, I've given you Evelyn, the photographer's biography, but we don't know the name of the man, the young man in the photograph. And in a way, you could tell another biography, which is the biography of the man in the picture. That might be, we might know that one day. I did do quite a lot of research to try and find out if we knew who he was, or if he was still alive. We might discover this at a certain point. So in a way, photographs don't just belong to the photographer. In a way, they somehow belong to the lives of the people in the pictures. And so that raises an interesting ethical question, but it also raises interesting questions about how we understand photographs, right? Do we understand them as simply the product of the photographer? Obviously, Hoffer couldn't make this picture of this man without him. So he's pretty essential to the making of the picture somehow. And it just seemed important to me to at least end this little piece of writing with another direction. This is not just about Hoffer. This is also about the person, the life of the person in the picture. I know Rong was very involved with the photographer Stephen Shaw. We're not looking at a Stephen Shaw picture, but I'll just tell you a little anecdote. I was preparing to record a conversation with the photographer Stephen Shaw. So one morning I had all of his books on my kitchen table, and my sister's partner looked through one of the books of pictures that Stephen Shaw made on the road in America in the 70s. And he got to the end of the book And he said, do you think there were a lot of MGB sports cars in America in the 70s? MGB was a little cute car. I said, I don't know. And he said, well, there are quite a lot in this book. So either there were quite a lot of them in America, or this photographer was very interested in them. And I said, well, you can ask the photographer, actually. He's coming for lunch because I'm going to record a conversation with him. So he asked Stephen at lunch about this. Why are there so many MGB cars in your photographs? And Stephen Shaw looked at me, and pointing at me, he said, Mr. Photography here would not ask me that question. He probably didn't notice that. And he said to Joe, my sister's boyfriend, are you a mechanic, or are you involved with cars? And he said, yes, I used to be a mechanic. And Stephen said, yeah, there are lots of MGB cars in my photographs. My wife had 2 MGB cars, and we were interested in them, and they do recur in the photographs. Well, what does that tell us? That tells us that when a viewer looks at a picture, they come with their own set of interests. They come with their own set of interests, and they look at they might appreciate the photograph, I don't know, as a picture, as a composition, but most photographs have social information in them. And we each respond to the social information slightly differently. I'm not saying completely differently. We have lots in common when we look at photographs. But you cannot rule out somebody looking at a photograph with very specialized knowledge and getting something else from it. So we're looking at a photograph by Andreas Gursky, Salerno, 1990. It's a very classical kind of view, high up on a hillside, looking down and across, and you see the patterns of human development. And if you look closely, you see the kind of different ages or eras of modern development. If you look up into the hills in the background, that's a very different kind of architecture and social organization from the cars arranged in the foreground there. Or in the midground, you can see containers, those boxes that have standardized shipping around the world. You can imagine taking a photograph like this into a classroom of very young children, and I don't think they will say, wow, that's a great photograph, but they will be interested in what it shows. Wow, look at all those cars. Why are they there? Where have they come from? That's not how we usually see cars. And you might start a conversation with them about international global trade, global capitalism, oil, any number of ways that might not be to do with quote unquote understanding a photograph. I guess if you see it in an art gallery framed on a wall, and it's quite a large print, maybe let's say 2 meters across. I think it's a little bit smaller than that. Yes, in a gallery, you might be encouraged to appreciate it as a photograph, but that's nothing to stop a viewer just engaging somehow with the social information that it describes. I'm not saying anything profound here. I'm saying something very, very obvious. But I think for us who are interested in photography, I think we sometimes forget that most people's response to photographs is not a very conscious aesthetic response or an appreciation of the photograph. Most of the time it's responding to the visual information. You can do everything at once, of course you can, but I think that's worth stating. Okay, that that's a sort of indication of the approach I made in the book. But I've just come back like 2 days ago from curating an exhibition of the work of Jeff Wall, the Canadian photographer, who is unusual in that he makes um, very single pictures. Not He doesn't make groups of pictures or projects or a body of work. Each time he just makes one photograph to stand and look at in the gallery space for as long as you like, and then you turn away and you look at another one, and they don't really have any obvious connections with each other. You might see certain patterns or similarities, something like that, but they're not really made as groups, bodies of work, just very, very single pictures. I've always been interested in Jeff Wall because that is unusual. As I said at the beginning, most of the time, even artists are thinking about their work as not quite singular photographs, but as assemblies of pictures in one way or the other. There's really not that many photographers that are happy just with one. The way Here we are, Jeff Wall, morning cleaning, Mies van der Rohe Foundation, Barcelona, 1999. Well, we can see that it's a kind of modernist architecture photographed in a particular way, and we can see that there's a man cleaning the glass part. Interestingly, Jeff Wall the other day said that the beginning of this was just wanting to make a photograph of someone cleaning glass, maybe cleaning a large area of glass. He just had that in his mind as a photograph that he might want to take one day. And then there was an invitation to maybe make a photograph at this building, which was originally built in 1929. And so Wall gets to make a photograph of a man cleaning glass, and it happens to be done here in this quite famous and quite influential kind of pavilion building. It's not a house or anything like that. It was just built to show off the kind of modern architectural spaces, materials, construction. It's very that gives the idea of cleaning glass maybe a larger context, cultural, historical context. And Wall has had to decide how he's going to do it. And the building gets cleaned in the morning, obviously before visitors come. So you might end up thinking about how modernism always has to look clean, as opposed to like a Baroque building or something like that, which lives with its own dirt and its own change, its patina over time. But I don't know if there's a kind of anything I can say that would instruct you how to understand this photograph. It's quite clear what's going on in the picture, that there's a kind of modernist building and there's a guy cleaning it. And that might be enough to hold your attention and explore the picture and enjoy it. And it might go in other directions. It might make you think about, I don't know, the politics of cleaning and wages for cleaning, and why is cleaning invisible to the public most of the time? Who knows? Wall is not. Wall is interested in what the viewer brings to the picture. What the viewer brings. There's not a point that is being made or anything like that. There's not an argument. There's not a correct way to understand it or not understand it. And if you see it in a gallery, it's a light box, maybe 2.5 meters wide. So transparency, so the light is coming from behind. One of the nice things about single large-scale photographs is the response can be quite social, quite collective. You know, if you think about the difference between watching a movie in a cinema, movie theater, and watching it on your laptop. Okay, the image is a different size in the movie theater, but also a movie theater is a social space. And interesting things happen in social spaces that are different from looking at something privately on your own in a book. Um, when a when a number of people are in the gallery together, they respond on their own, but they also respond communally in a way. Um, the communal aspect is quite undefined, I think, but it is important. If you go back through the history of photographic art before photographers were thinking about things that are at a quite large scale, it meant you had to go right up to the wall and look at something small, and that can be great, can be very beautiful. But it doesn't have that social dimension of looking, which interests me as a curator. I like to spend time in the exhibitions I've curated just watching how people engage with images. It's a really fascinating thing to do. I'm not like a kind of wizard who knows exactly how viewers are going to respond. A lot of the time, I've got very little idea. So I'm always interested in how it happens. This group here is looking at another of Wall's pictures called After Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, the prologue. Invisible Man was a novel that was written by Ralph Ellison, published in 1952. And in that novel, at the beginning, in the prologue, Ellison describes how the main character in the book is thinking about what it's like to be Black in post-war America. And he finds himself in the basement of a building, and he's going to write a novel about what it is to be Black in post-war America. And he's going to live in this room, and he's going to take electricity from the building above. It's a very short description in the novel, but Wall just got the idea to make a picture of it. You know, when you're reading a novel, there are no images, but you have images in your head, and this was just a situation that Wall wanted to make into a picture. It's probably his most kind of busy composition. There's so much in it to look at, and you probably need that scale in the gallery space to really do it. So what's the relation between this and story? You know, I talked about a photograph suspending a story, not really telling a story. Photographs are good at situations, but they're not very good at storytelling or narrating. I think viewers, when they look, can make up their own version of the story, or they can not do that and just enjoy looking at the picture. It's not a very usual, typical kind of a photograph. You're more likely to see something like this maybe in cinema, maybe. But I think it's a picture that people like because there's lots to look at there, and it does have this connection with story because it's a picture of a man writing. He's actually drying his bowl there. He's probably eaten his dinner, which you can see his little kitchen on the left. And if you look very closely, he's dripped water across the floor to sit down to dry his bowl. And he's looking at sheets of his writing of the novel, and there are more sheets hanging on the back of that green chair. So the more you look at it, the more it's a little bit like looking at a crime scene photograph where there's like details and you can kind of put them all together. But there's no great mystery to this. That's if you're offered a chance to look at a photograph like this, you will. And your experience of it is going to be different. If you're Black, your experience of it is going to be different if you're a man or a woman, or whether you know the novel or not, or whether you're American or not, or come from a city or not. There are all of these little variables. But that doesn't mean there's not also something kind of common, kind of, I wouldn't say universal, but something slightly common between us when we're looking as well. There's a picture on the right here called Changing Room, which is a slightly more simple example of what I've been talking about here. So it's a changing room like you might find in a clothing store or a department store. And you don't often see photographs in changing rooms. They're usually quite private spaces, aren't they? But something strange is going on here. And the more time you spend with the photograph, the more likely you are, I think, to put together some kind of story. So what are we looking at? There's a curtain. So this woman has come through into the changing room. She's closed the curtain. She maybe has a dark overcoat, and there are two of these red and white dresses, and two hangers that are hanging up on the left. So presumably she's taken off the dress that she arrived in. She's put on a red dress, and maybe she's now putting on her original dress over the top. It could be that there's something mysterious going on. It could be that she's trying to steal the dress, that she's a thief, and that she somehow managed to get two dresses into the changing room. And she's going to put on one of the dresses and then put on her original dress, and then take out the second dress and say to the shop assistant, it doesn't fit, or I don't want it, and maybe walk out of the store with one. I don't know. You'd have to think about that. That's a kind of narrative storytelling reading. But there's something else going on, which is where is this photograph taken from? I mean, we can presume that a changing room will have a mirror in it. Never seen a changing room that doesn't have a mirror. That's what they're for. So you can see what you look like. So Wall has taken the photograph from where the mirror would be, let's say, in this little space. That might suggest something like surveillance, one of those two-way mirrors where someone can look through from one side, but from the other side, you only see a reflection. It could be that, or it could be just a kind of artificial situation where Wall has set it up. Mirrors are interesting in photography. Obviously, I think people think a lot about the relation between photography and mirrors. The very earliest writers on photography were interested in the photography as a mirror of nature, or a mirror with a memory. Photographers are always taking pictures of mirrors. Every photographer does it sooner or later. So they have a very interesting status, I think, within photography. And this is a very simple but also complex exploration of that. Anyway, look, I've talked for a long, long time, but I hope you get the kind of idea that I'm thinking about here, that there aren't I'm not so much interested in instructing people how to understand a photograph, but I am interested in helping people think about how they understand photographs, which most of the time is very unconscious. Great, thank you very much.
好的，这个非常感谢坎帕尼先生的精彩分享。那么坎帕尼先生呢，刚才这个讲的很精彩。我听了之后呢，对，首先我感到非常亲切的，就是说，坎帕尼先生说他的精神分析是他的一个知识背景，跟我这个我就听起来很亲切，因为我对精神分析，对拉康理论都是这个非常感兴趣的，也是我呢这个思考这个影像，包括这个视觉艺术一个非常重要的一个维度。对，卡帕尼先生刚才讲到的那本小说。中文版的名字叫《看不见的人》。这个小说我还真是看过，大约在20多年前看过这本一个黑人作家写的。对，这个一个很厚的长篇小说，这个我是看过的。那么这个卡帕尼先生刚才呢提到了一个非常重要的问题，就是这个照片为什么呃，我们为什么这个每个人看它都是不一样的。实际上呢，这个摄影师，实际这个照片呢，里面蕴藏了很多无意识的内容，就说它跟我们呢，看这个在现实的这个空间里头，我们可能不会想到那么多的这个关于它的意义什么，因为首先我们要行动，就是我们哪条路我们应该怎么走，别走错路。我们这个看红绿灯，别让车撞到，对不对？然后我们有个在现实中有个空间感，所以那个时候我们的这个大脑的思考呢是第一人称叙事的，对。当这个照片呢，因为照片我们进不去，因为这个影像的世界我们是进入不了的。就它那里面儿的，无论是这个有很多东西什么的，我们只能把它当成一个对象来观看。所以这时候呢，它那个身体那种空间感、行动这些东西呢就被屏蔽了。我们只能够就要那个长久的来观看，而且那些平常在现实空间中我们未必关注到那些细节，我们就来进行解读。实际摄影师呢，在拍那个照片时候，他呢关注了某一个地方，但是也有为什么有无意识呢？就是他有没有关注的地方。但是照片不管呢，摄影师怎么关注，但是他全部都是全都给在这个被这个影像所吸纳。所以我们在看的时候，为什么是自由的呢？就是每个人看的是自由的呢，是根据我们自身的欲望，是我们自身的那个视觉的关注点。他这个关注点有可能跟摄影师的当时的这个拍摄时的关注点既有可能是重合的，也有可能是不一样的。即使是一样的，我们有可能我们的理解也是不一样的，因为只要一附加意义，这个意义都是从语言通道，从这个我们这个语义的那个大脑中语义通道来进入的，所以呢，每个人对它的理解是不一样的。所以我后面在分享我的那个时候，我会提到，就当年19世纪那些现实主义作家，在他看到现实的生活的那个场景的时候，他是怎么进行描写的？在描写的同时，实际上好像是在客观的描述，实际上它是有价值判断的。是有它，因为语言本身就有褒义、中性词、贬义词，就有这些东西，所以只要他用语言意来这个复述这个照片的时候，他的立场和他的这个好恶就会自动的就会呈现出来。这个在批评家解读照片的时候也是一样的。所以呢，这些东西呢，只是说它是对照片的某一种特定立场的解读，而不等于那个照片本身。这些内容我先不说。一会儿呢，我最后作为主持人，我还是最后来来跟大家分享。现在呢，我还是先有请我们今天的这个语坛嘉宾，姜荣老师和陈国森老师，先跟大家打个招呼。然后呢，哎，你们一些个问题跟坎帕尼，你们先咱们一起聊。好的，这个姜荣老师，陈国森老师，你们跟观众打个招呼。
好，观众朋友们好，我是姜荣。
大家好，我是陈国森。
好的，那么这个姜蓉老师呢和这个国森老师呢，为了今天的这个对谈，都做了充分的准备。当然，我本人也做了充分的准备。我们对都是这个有一些个要跟卡帕尼先生这个来这个讨论的一些个关于这个摄影作品的一些个我们的一些个思考和理解。对，那么还是有请姜蓉老师这个来开始，好吧？嗯。
好，谢谢主持人赞策老师啊，非常感谢坎帕尼老师刚才给我们做的非常精彩的一个演讲。我觉得他从很多的维度呢，告诉我们应该如何去观看一幅照片。我的听下来的时候，我的理解是，一幅摄影作品，它如何去观看呢？往往是取决于一个观者的背景情况，包括他的学养，包括他的成长的经历，包括他的意识形态等等，都会都会决定一个观者如何去观看一幅摄影作品。那同样，摄影师尽管他没有办法，像刚才坎帕尼老师所说的，没有办法去决定他所创作的一幅影像最后的含义是什么。但是我觉得一个摄影师，优秀的摄影师是应该有他的 intentionality， 有他创作的一个初衷，一个观念。那么这个观念呢，我觉得是很重要的，它应该是能够，反映在他的作品里边。如果这位艺术家他能够很好的掌控如何将自己的一个观念和他的intentionality， 就是他的这个意向、创作的意向、创作的意图，能够把它转换成影像。如果他有这方面的能力的话，我个人感觉一个艺术家的创作理念也是能够使得他作品产生含义的一个办法。当然这个呢是不是能够传递给观者，那观者呢是不是能够从中得到一个反响，当然又有观者自己的一个主观能动性和他的局限性都存在。同时呢这个就让我想起来罗兰巴特曾经讲过作者已死，是吧，这么一个说法。也就是说一个不管是小说也好摄影作品也好，其实更多的是要由观者由读者去阅读。但是同时如果我们谈摄影的话，就会让我想起 Jeff Wall， 也就是刚才坎帕尼老师所介绍他刚刚测的这个展览，他曾经创作的一幅作品叫做为女性而做的图像Picture for Women。 其中我们就能看到那幅作品是一幅单幅作品，那么它实际上在这个作品的正中间是一台相机，放在山脚下的相机，然后右边是摄影师本人，就是 Jeff Wall 本人，然后在左边的前景是一位女士。那这个女士的眼光呢，实际上她是透过一个镜子拍摄的。那么这个眼光又看向了摄影师，或者也看向了我们的观众。那我们的观众在观看他们的时候，其实这里边有好几层的含义在里边。同时我觉得那幅作品也反映了摄影如何去观看的一个，或者如何去创作的一个含义在里边。因为它牵涉到一个三角的关系，也就是摄影作品、相机、摄影师和被摄者这三者之间的关系。我想到刚才坎帕尼老师说到摄影作品的含义其实有很多是由这个权力构成的，谁的权力更大就有可能决定这个摄影的含义。在过去来说，摄影师的权力比较大，他可以让被摄者，他可以摆弄这个被摄者，让他怎么做怎么看，就像在照相馆里边拍一张照片一样，摄影师可以让被摄者摆出什么样的姿势等等。 那我的问题就是，坎帕尼老师，你觉得，有两个问题。第一，就是摄影师的这个主观意向、创作意向，是不是能决定这个作品的最后的含义？这是第一个问题。第二个相关的问题就是，摄影机作为一个机械，它会有一个中介的过程、过滤的过程。它有的时候能反映，能够很好的反映，像大画幅相机在肖尔来看，就能够很好的反映他的主观能动性，他的这个观念，但是并不是所有的时候相机都能够反映。所以呢，我在想问，就是如果相机不能反映的话，又会是什么样的一个情况？我就想让唐帕尼老师再谈一谈，就是这三者被摄者，如果被摄者不合作的话，又是一个什么样的一个情况？就这个三角关系如何能够决定一个摄影作品的含义？谢谢。
That's a very good question, although it's about 5 questions. Let's take the first one where you began around intentionality. I think, yeah, photographs are made with more or less levels of intentionality, from almost no intentionality, chance, to something very highly constructed. That doesn't necessarily mean that if a photograph has a lot of intentionality, that its meaning is going to be clear or intentional. I mean, we've just looked at some of Jeff Wall's pictures there, and there's clearly a lot of intentionality, but the intentionality is around how to organize a picture, not necessarily how to organize meaning or dictate response. You can put all of your intentionality into a picture in order to leave its meaning very open. Intentionality doesn't mean you are like a mechanic making a message that is kind of put out and the audience receives it. I guess it can be like that, and I suppose advertisers try to do that. Although there's a very famous expression in advertising that says half the money in the world of advertising is wasted, but nobody knows which half. So even when you're trying to make very intentional pictures, meaning is not guaranteed. There is, in the world of culture generally, what we call conventions or cliches or stereotypes. And that's when, a photographer or a writer or a musician inhabits an existing ideology, an existing set of attitudes, in order to guarantee a kind of quick message, right? But that let's say if it's a photograph, and let's say it's a stereotypical representation of a man of a certain kind, that only works because there have been thousands of others doing exactly the same thing. That so you can have you could argue that the photographs with the most clear meanings are the most cliched ones, the most stereotypical ones. Any photograph that diverges from that is going to be ambiguous. That seems kind of obvious. All right, that's the first point. The second point about the camera itself, this is a really interesting one, I think. Photographers, particularly artists, very rarely want to tell you or very rarely want to accept how much the camera is doing. Because part of their art is to use a machine, and they want to tell you that their intentionality is to do with how you use the machine. But I don't think the photographer's relation to the camera is the same as the novelist's relation to their pen. I think the camera is doing quite a lot. And if we come back to that question of intention, it's quite clear that a lot of the early commentators on photography noticed how much work the camera is doing beyond intention. Fox Talbot, William Henry Fox Talbot, at one point in The Pencil of Nature says, the camera will give you more detail than any artist. I think he meant painter. Than any artist would bother to put there. That somehow you open the shutter, and the world as light floods in, and you'll get in the picture things that you didn't even see yourself. Of course you do. Of course you do. I'll give you a good example of this, which also folds us back into this question of the unconscious. A long time ago, when I was young, in the 1990s, Nelson Mandela, the Black South African leader, or the Black South African resistance fighter, as he was then, was released from jail. And one of the first places he came to outside of South Africa was Brixton in South London, area of London where I lived. Very large black population, which is part of the reason he came there. And thousands of us gathered to see him because he had been in jail for 27, 28 years. And when we finally saw him, he came up a staircase and he stood, the other people with him stood on the staircase, waved to the crowd. I'd never seen such emotion and excitement, people crying. And I remember it was a very hot day, a woman fainted. Incredible moment, symbolic kind of political moment. And then the next day, I was living in a house with some friends. The next day, we bought all of the newspapers, 7 or 8 newspapers, daily newspapers, because we wanted to see how this event was covered in the newspapers. And my friend laid them out on the breakfast table, and there were 4 or 5 of us, and we had all been there the day before to see Mandela. And a friend said, did anyone see Prince Charles? None of us saw Prince Charles. But in the photographs, it was quite clear that Prince Charles was standing right next to Nelson Mandela. None of us had seen him. Why had none of us seen him? Well, our eyes, let's put it like that, probably had seen him, but we didn't like the idea of the British monarchy or a representative British monarchy and everything it represents about colonialism. We didn't want that next to Nelson Mandela. So we had unconsciously blocked him out. Interesting. But the photographs clearly showed that he was standing next to, Prince Charles was standing next to Nelson Mandela. And my girlfriend at the time, she said, well, this could be a day when we can all be proud of our unconscious, that we somehow didn't want to accept that. But the camera was not choosing. Okay, it would have been very difficult to get a picture of Nelson Mandela without Prince Charles standing next to him. So the camera in that instance was doing something that maybe the photographer was only, or the many photographers were only thinking about Nelson Mandela, or maybe they were thinking about Nelson Mandela and Prince Charles next to each other. For us, who were in the crowd, we never saw him, even though he was right there. It's a bit like a magic trick, you know, the way a close-up magician does something to distract you while something is doing something else with his other hand. Sometimes our visual experience can be a little bit like that. And in fact, Walter Benjamin, one of the interesting writers on photography from the 20s and 30s, German, talked about the optical unconscious. The camera, the way the camera offers us things beyond what we actually see is one of its most significant characteristics. And maybe that optical unconscious goes beyond intention. In fact, I would say it always goes beyond intention. In photographs, you get more than you wanted. The photographer gets more than they wanted. The viewer gets more than they want. There's a lot. There's almost too much going on in a photograph for any stable meaning. If you look at how photographs are used in children's books, for example, where the aim of a children's book is to try to communicate quite clearly, they have to be very careful how they use photographs, because a child doesn't know if the thing in the background of the picture is more interesting than so they often kind of cut things out, cut shapes out, and that tells you how wild and unstable photographic meaning can be, way beyond intention. Sorry, it's a long answer, but it's a good question. I think about it a lot.
这个我先插一下，对，那个我觉得卡帕尼老师刚才举的这个例子非常的有意思，所以我也想这个用简短的这个参与一下这个问题的讨论，我觉得这个问题非常有意思。因为呢，这个姜老师知道，我在这个前几个月，我专门又重新写了那篇文章，叫《大脑与眼球的遭遇》。对，这个对，那里边专门讲这个，就是说，实际上我们看到的，并不是我们那个眼球视网膜看到的，那个相机看到的，相当于视网膜看到的。它是一个自下而上的信息啊，就是那个它照单全收的。但是呢，真正我们看到的那个视觉信息啊，是经过大脑的那个神经元一系列复杂的运作，那几个视觉通道的一个运作，重新这个我们看到那个东西，也就是我们意识关注那个东西。这里头呢，那个自上而下的那个作用，实际起到了非常大的。也就是说，我们当时只关注那个曼德拉，对，没有看到那个他其他的那个东西。恰恰被我们大脑呢，其实我们的眼球是看到了的，但是呢，恰恰是被我们大脑的那个注意力、那个所谓的意识的探照灯给排除在那个那个光照之外了。对，所以这就是无意识的东西。那么那个相机实际相当于我们眼球看到那个东西，所以摄影呢非常有意思。这个观看实际就是我认为相当于大脑与眼球的一种遭遇，就是说我们当时没有注意到的东西，实际在被我们那个相机所看到那个在照片里，又给我们这个做了一个提示，就说当时我们那个无意识的东西，让重新被召唤回来了。对，所以这个非常有意思，我就简单说这些。然后这个郭森老师，这个你这个准备那些问题，对你也继续，然后一会儿我再针对这些其他问题，我再说一些我的这个观点。好的，郭森。
好，谢谢大家，谢谢张策老师和张老师。我想请问一下老师们，在我提问题之前，是不是我可以先简单的回应一下 Campany 刚刚关于这
好的。
我的问题是放在姜荣老师的 comments 后面会比较合适，所以我想我就先不提问，我可能跟他先简单回应一下他这幅我的看法，然后等到姜荣老师做完这个分享之后，我们再进行我的提问，好吗？Yeah. So, yeah, hello, David Company, and it's honestly such a pleasure to have the chance to talk with you. And but I would like to say before my question, I would like to respond to you about the some issues relating to Jeff Wall's pictures. Yeah. So, I won't be asking anything in this part because I just would like to share a few of my own thoughts. I think it might make more sense for me to ask my question after John Ron's comments and presentations. Yeah, so I totally agree with you with your rating of the fall because if I had to sum up my own feeling about his images in one word. I don't think there's anything more fitting than obscurity.
Mm.
He's always trying to sort of illuminate obscurity in some way, but that obscurity can never be fully decoded, right? Yeah, his photographs are always packed with this inexplicable little details. Yeah, so I would like to give us an example. Yeah, this picture, this photo, that troops talk.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
say this picture to put simply, just was showing us two worlds here. One is the dead Soviet soldiers. Mm,
Yeah.
the guys, yeah, they're talking to each other, even someone's laughing or sleeping, something like that. And then there's another world, the Afghan man who's stealing from them. Maybe, yeah, you can say he's rummaging through their bags, like he's searching for something. Um,
Mm-hmm.
because it's such a ironic layer to the whole image. And in the upright corner,
Yeah.
yeah, in the upright corner, we can see two pairs of feet, but you can't really tell whether they belong to the living or the dead. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so in that sense, as a photographer of modern life, maybe which of course is a little a title. Sorry, I will end up my
Mm-hmm.
screen. Um, maybe a title borrowed from Manet is actually making, I think, therefore, he's actually making statements about contemporary life. I
Mm-hmm.
think maybe he found a truly remarkable way to doing that for me, because one of Jeff Wald's biggest contributions is that um, he's created a new way of making statements about contemporary life, and at the same time, a new model of labor. This very idea of a model of labor is actually comes from a scholar I really admire, Professor Joel Roberts. Is now a professor in art and aesthetics in the University of Wolverhampton. Yeah, he
Yeah.
talks about this quite a bit in his book, Photography and Its Violations.
Yeah.
So by constructing his images in the studio, Jeff Wall manages to produce work and he doesn't lose the visual pleasure of the image itself.
Mm-hmm.
Still, you can say, still deeply engages with how we conceptualize or how we think about the world around us. So on one hand, through his complex compositions, he makes the image as rich and maybe layered as painting in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, But on the other hand, and I think this is the vital bit, yeah, he achieves all that through a kind of cinematographic process. Yeah,
Mhm.
this mode of labor turns photography into a large scale or more collaborative collaborative something uh, a production and almost like filmmaking with studios, casting
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
long production cycles, something like this. Yeah. By doing that, and he moves photography away from the individualist model of something maybe like the decisive moment. Yeah.
Mhm.
And embeds it directly within the social and
Mhm.
economic relations of contemporary life.
Mhm.
So it's not just depicting modern life from the outside. Yeah, I think his artistic practice maybe is part of the modern system of production. Yeah, so the issues like politics or race, something like this for him, I think they are not just um, something optional themed or optional motives, not in the way that Michael Fried might put it, as if you could choose to care about Black experience or
Mhm.
say about queer identity. It's not like that. I think politics and the question of reality are maybe always and entangled with and evolving into that maybe same obscurity in his images.
Yeah.
No, there's a kind of maybe based condition, underlying condition, something that's built into the work from the start. So beyond all that, but I would like to say what's best about Jeff Wall's photographs. It isn't really in the parts you can explain clearly in theory or something like that. It's more like what you mentioned earlier, that mirror in his photo, that mirror, yeah. So for instance, that's exactly the kind of thing I mean. Yeah, anyway, just a few thoughts I would like to
Yeah.
share with you. Yeah, thank you
That's
very much.
great. That's great. You touched on a lot of things there. I think it's I would like to, when it comes to Jeff Wall, I would rather think about each individual image because these questions come up differently in different ones. Um, so in the same way that I said, there's photographs and there's photography. there's there's Jeff Wall's individual pictures, and then there's the way people talk about Jeff Wall as if it's it's all highly intentional, it's all very cinematic, it's all very labored. That varies from picture to picture. Uh, It's interesting that you mentioned Cartier-Bresson and the decisive moment, because obviously that is a form of a mode of photography which collapses the distance between noticing and picture making. Something happens and you make a picture of it in the moment, right? The decisive moment. Um, in a way that leaves you um, somehow outside of photography in a way. What do I mean by that? Well, in if you're making a film, you kind of have to climb inside things. You might have to find locations. You might have to make sets. You might have to do some lighting. You might have to find performers. But but you would still be waiting for the spontaneous chance, the spontaneous gift. Humans are amazing and unpredictable. And if you tell humans exactly what to do in a photograph, they look like mannequins, they look like zombies. And so even though Jeff Wall might arrange a situation, let's say, he still has to take many photographs because he's waiting for the people in his pictures to just do something that he wasn't expecting. So within the intentionality, within the control, within the labor, there is still the gift of spontaneity in the way that Cartier-Bresson would understand it. And in fact, I mean, I can say this because I have talked to Jeff Wall a lot, and I've known him for a couple of decades. He's very interested in those 20th century street photographers because in a way that's a kind of perfect kind of photography, isn't it? It's something photography can do that no other medium can do. You go out into the world with this light, flexible piece of equipment, and you can make something extraordinary with very little labor, with very little time. It's possible. We know this is possible. Jeff once told me that in really looking at those 20th century street photographers, he noticed that, let's say, if you look at their books, and then you look at their contact sheets with all the pictures that they took, they managed to get a good one between 1 in 300 and 1 in 600, roughly. So roughly between 10 rolls of film and 20 rolls of film if it's 35. Jeff said, well, it's interesting. I have to take about that many pictures. I have to take between 300 and 600 because I don't know quite what to expect. I'm still waiting for chance. So, and again, chance is, what is chance? It's like something beyond intentionality, but you have to recognize that it's happening. You're still responding in the moment. If we go back to Dead Troops Talk, I don't know what that picture means. I think it's a really interesting picture, and it's a really interesting social and historical situation. And yes, it's dead troops talking, after an ambush. Can't remember what the long title is. So yeah, it's a kind of imagining of soldiers coming to life after they've died. But what does he call the picture? He calls it Dead Troops Talk. What did I say at the beginning? A photograph is silent. We'll never know what they're saying to each other. We will never know what they are saying to each other. You would think, wouldn't you, that making a photograph about talking would be self-defeating. But actually, Jeff has made many photographs about talking and conversation, and it's often there in the title. Dead Troops Talk, the storyteller, the listener, diatribe, outburst. There are many, many photographs he's made where you are looking at people verbalizing with each other, and you will never know. You're never going to know what they said at all. And a photograph can be interesting on the basis of what it cannot do. And in fact, I would say that all photographs are interesting on the basis of what they cannot do as much as what they can do. And so it's not it's not so crazy to make a picture about talking. In a way, it's going to be interesting, a picture about talking, because you're not going to know.
Yeah, okay, yeah, thank you very much.
好的，这个谢谢卡帕尼先生。这个卡帕尼先生呢，对他的很多思路啊，实际上对，实际我是非常同意的，也恰恰是我这个观点，就是说，影像本身是沉默的，影像是不能够开口说话的。那么这个对。它实际上呢，之所以这个我们用语言这个来描述它，是因为我们看的人在我们的由于那个视觉的东西引起了我们那个一个对这个视觉东西的一个反思，来这个来描述它。但是这两个之间实际是不在一个频道上的，对。所以正好我也以这个两张照片的这个我认为完全相反的一个解读来这个讲一下我对这个解读照片的一个思路。对，比如说呢，这个肖尔的这张照片啊，那么这个艺术家斯滕菲尔德啊，我记得他在一篇文章里头就讲到，他说这个啊，在画面中啊，这个城镇与乡村如何如何，然后他说前面这个丑陋的这种现代的商业建筑啊，与这个后面的这个白色的啊，代表这种精神高度的这个教堂啊，形成一种对比，如何如何。这个就让我想到了呢，这个19世纪那些个自然主义和现实主义的作家，像这个斯汤达呀，像巴尔扎克呀，像他们这些个作家，他们呢不是在描述这个影像，而是在呢描述他们眼睛看到的现实的时候呢，只要他们一进入描写一有语义的东西的时候，哎，他们实际上那个语言那个频道就会对他们的视觉所看到的东西进行一个价值判断。所以它就已经有褒贬、有这个立场在内了，这是语言的一个非常重要的特征。那么针对这个肖尔这幅照片，我也完全可以，因为照片是沉默的，他自己是不说话的，那个话语都是我们通过我们的这个大脑思考赋予他的。那么对于这张照片，我完全可以进行另外一个解读，对吧？那我说这个前面是现代的，那么后面是怀旧的，那么时代在发展。如何，这个我就完全可以赋予这样一个照片相反的一个意义，它也是成立的。对，因为照片本身是不可能说话的。我们所有的价值判断都是实际上是由观看者和批评家在我们的那个大脑那个思维里赋予它的。那么我们为什么会赋予它这个不同的这个价值判断呢？恰恰呢，这个跟精神分析有关了。为什么呢？因为我们的那个欲望对象不同。实际上，那个照片中的不同的对象在召唤我们，所那个欲望对象，所以我们会对我们所关注的那个东西来进行一个重点的这个描述，而我们在描述的时候，也同时会忽略其他的部分，然后再进入到另外那张照片后面，徐斌。
Mm-hmm.
西边翻页，哎对，然后呢，这张呢是一张非常著名的照片，就是这个约翰伯格这张照片呢，对他这个解读呢也是非常的著名的。他认为这个农民啊，三个农夫啊，穿上这样不合体的西装如何，然后他解读这大家我不重复了，大家这个对这个都很熟悉。但是我发现呢，我完全可以对这张照片给一个完全相反的解读。为什么呢？因为上流社会的人就一定穿着很得体吗？这难道不是一种刻板印象吗？难道不是桑德在利用这样一种所谓的文化的那种一个刻板印象，来这个认为上流社会的人一定是穿着很得体的，那么这个农民穿上这个西服与他身份说有这种视觉上的反差，但我恰恰也可以解读为他恰恰因为没有关注，他没有去拍摄那些上流社会的人。其中的不修边幅和邋邋遢遢的人 所以我们的这个照片呈现这种样子。那么我们摄影不是在顺应这样的一种刻板印象，而恰恰应该抵抗这样一种刻板印象。对，我完全可以对这篇照片，也进行一个不同的解读。这完全取决于不在于照片本身，照片是沉默的，完全取决于我们自己的这样的一种思考的背景和我们的赋予它的语境。好，再往后翻，徐斌。对，
Mhm.
是，对，再往后翻这一页就不讲了。对，对，呃，再往后，对，所以呢，这个照片呢是一种虚构。哎，不对，回来，对，照片呢是一种虚构。那么对照片的解读呢，那么我认为就是虚构的虚构。所以说，照片如果指向的它某个场景，它实际是指向的是用我们摄影师的目光指向了那个一片的场域，而在那一片场域里，它的背景是什么，主体是什么，这些东西完全取决于我们投向这样一种场域的目光的位置，而我们的所有的解读呢，都不是一种对影像的说明书，而恰恰是什么呢？恰恰是我们对于在这个影像中把我们自己的主体置于哪样的一个话语的位置，实际是我们解读的人把我们自己的主体位置镶嵌在了那样一个话语的那个位置里，对，而不代表这个照片本身的意义所在。但是它是对照片的那个不能说话那个沉默的那个场域的一种填充。所以呢，不论是影像作品也好，还是视觉艺术作品也好，它的真正的精彩部分，在我看来，恰恰是不可被解读的那部分，也就是罗兰巴特所讲的那个次点，就不可以被语言所填充的部分，不可以被意义所覆盖那个部分，或者说被意义覆盖，也不等于它本身那一部分。对，而那个视觉艺术也好，这个影像作品也好，它传递的实际是一种更多的是一种身体的体验，是一种感知，而不是一种意义的这种意义的话语的传递。好，我就简单的说这些。今天时间可能有点紧张，对对对，大家都很踊跃。对，我想听听这个坎帕尼先生的回应。嗯。
That's very interesting. Can we look at the Stephen Shaw picture again, the first one? A few years ago, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, I was asked by a publisher to write an essay for a book that was celebrating a collection of photographs that was put together by an American pharmaceutical company. And in this collection were many photographs by well-known photographers, but they had collected only pictures that included pharmacies. And this picture was in their collection. Now, I have known this picture since I was maybe 20 years old, and I never even noticed the fact that there is a pharmacy in it. Now I can't think of anything but the pharmacy when I look at the picture. So yes, we can decide that there's something interesting to be said about the way the picture is organized with the past and the present and progress. But it also has a pharmacy in it, and I didn't even notice that until there was a context that made me think about it. And that in this book, in this collection, there are photographs by many famous, Cartier-Bresson and Robert Frank and Helen Levitt and Ouija and all kinds of people. And I had never noticed the pharmacies in these pictures until that was pointed out to me by the context. And then if we go to the August Sander picture, Sander, as we know, made this project to photograph the big survey of the German people, and he did publish a book 1928 or 29, with 60 of these pictures in it. So this is a little bit before the Nazi Party came to power in 1933. And I want everybody to imagine, let's say it's 1929, and there's a bookshop in Berlin, and in the bookshop there is a pile of August Sander's book. It's called Antlitz der Zeit, the face of our time. 60 portraits. Who would be buying that book? Would it be people who are interested in photography as a serious art? Would it be people who would take a more sociological or anthropological interest? Would it be people who are interested in fashion and dress, the way people are dressing? Would people read the book as a commentary on German society, even a political commentary, perhaps? We actually don't know. But the interesting thing about photography is that it can exist at the meeting point of so many different frames of reference and ways of thinking. Of course, now Sander is regarded as a great figure in the history of photography, and pretty much all students of photography will learn about Sander. But back in the 20s, nobody was really thinking like that. Of course, Sander is taking his photography very seriously. He's taking his project very seriously. But there are ways of thinking about photographs that are so layered and so complex that somehow that complexity must be part of our response to them. Yes, you can make a reading. You can make an emphatic reading if you want of any picture and of why it's important and of why it's significant. But it may not get us to this very layered complexity. I don't think. I can give you another sort of related example about this kind of layering. I was once asked by an American publisher, Aperture, to put together a book of photography made on road trips in America. So Robert Frank, Justine Kurland, William Eggleston, Gary Winogrand, Inga Marath, lots of great photography in America, in the US, was made on the road, traveling by car, Stephen Shaw included. And when the book was published, I was asked by the biggest bookstore in London to do a signing of the book. So I went along at the correct time, and I went to the photography department on the third floor of the bookstore, and I said, "Oh, I'm here to do the book signing for the book, The Open Road." That was the title of the book. And the woman said, "We don't have any book signings today in the photography department." And I checked my email and I had the time correct. And she said, "Wait a minute, I need to look at the schedule, the timetable of book signings." And she said, "No, your signing is happening on the ground floor in the travel section, travel books." And I said, "But we're on the third floor and I can see my book in the photography section. And she said, yes, we have it in the photography section and we've sold 7 copies so far. But in the travel section, we've sold like 120 copies. So where do you want to do your book signing, Mr. Campany? So I went down to the ground floor. Well, that tells you that there are people buying that book who don't even know the names of these photographers. That they're maybe not even thinking about photography the way that we do because we like photography. Maybe they want something else from the pictures. I don't know, nostalgia or a sense of landscape or American culture or something, which is always there, of course. And I feel the same about Sander. I'm really, and I think it's a question we can't answer. What those photographs meant when he published that book at the end of the 1920s in Germany. It's very mysterious to me what they would have meant. I like John Berger's response to this picture. It's great. But it's not the end of it. You know, there's so many different ways. Whenever I look, for example, and this sounds crazy, whenever I look at this photograph, I think of the guy on the left with the cigarette and how similar he looks to the Hollywood actor Richard Gere. That's a crazy reading of this picture. Ridiculous, but it's there.
好的，谢谢卡帕尼先生。对，我觉得这个照片，对，就是文字对于它的，就是语言对于它的覆盖，实际上呢，永远不可能完美的这个解读一幅影像，一幅这个影像作品。因为什么呢？因为语言是分节的，就是它的这个密度跟那个视觉是不一样的。因为一幅照片，或者一个影像作品，它是没有它这个密度是非常密的，对，它是连接的，这是我们视觉整个看下来的。而语言呢，它是分节的，它是这个它无法把那个密度彻底的给转换过来。另外呢，就说你比如说一个19世纪的现实主义作家，他无论怎么描述一个场景，但我们只能通过大脑去想象一个我们经验中的某种类似的场景，我们永远看不到那个小说里描写的场景到底是什么样子。但是摄影呢，是可以让我们看到这个样子。但是摄影的妙处，也就是它的这个最有意思的地方，恰恰是什么呢？是让我们破除我们已有的记忆中的那个印象的想象的样子，是让我们获得一种视觉上的惊喜。实际它是破除语言的那个刻板的那个东西的。我觉得这个恰恰是摄影的给我们带来的最有价值的部分的这个所在。好，谢谢卡帕尼先生。下面那个有请姜荣老师继续他的这个提问。
All right, thank you, the moderator. So, David, I also have some visuals for the next question, which is also the last question. So I would like to say it in English. So, as you know, for more than half a century, Sebastian Salgado photographed major events around the world until he passed away earlier this year. Mm-hmm. So he has been regarded as one of the great photographers by many people. He was certainly a humanistic photographer. But I think there is an issue regarding his photographs. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that he was more like a photojournalist than a fine art photographer, because the subject matters of his photography are mostly related with events that are newsworthy. However, I think he has tried to become a fine art photographer by making his photos of human suffering and environmental damage aesthetically beautiful. Mm-hmm. But there is a clear line, as you know, between photojournalism and fine art. Salgado tend to mix up those two genres of photography, in my view. Mm-hmm. For example, in this photo, a photo of a woman he took in Mali in 1985. At the first look, it really come across as Virgin Mary. But then after reading the captions, we realized that actually she was actually blinded by sandstorms and chronic eye infections. Mm-hmm. He was waiting for food distribution. But Salgado did not even know her name, did not even mention her name in the caption. Mm-hmm. So as a contrast, as you also know this image, and we all know this image very well, that Walker Evans took this photo when he traveled to the South in 1936. Mm-hmm. And this is a photo of a woman who is wife of a tenant farmer, and her name is Borrow, right? Addie Mae Burroughs. Mm-hmm. And she was 27. She was a mother of 4. Mm-hmm. And Yvonne took her portrait at the eye level with mm-hmm. a respectful and objective approach. Mm-hmm. He did not make any judgment on her, nor did he try to aestheticize her, I believe. So let's look at another photo of Salgado. Mm-hmm. In this photo, which was taken in the same country, Mali, and at the same year, in the same year as he took the previous photo of that blind woman. This photo, when we look at it for the first time, it really came across as sort of like a historical painting, a painting of historical genre, like something which looks very grandeur and beautiful in a way, for me at least. But then when we look at the caption again, it's actually about nomads who had to cross the desert to reach the outskirts of cities in the hope of finding food and a shelter. Mm-hmm. But Salgado took it at the low angle. That makes the nomads look taller. Mm-hmm. As a contrast, we also are familiar with this image, which was taken by one of the Farm Security Administration photographer Arthur Rothstein. And I think he took this photo also at the eye level as Walker Evans did. Mm-hmm. And it's about farmers' situation during a dust storm. So then Salgado took another photo of this one. This is a photo which also looks very beautiful to me. He took it again from a low angle and make it look like a pyramid, a triangle composition. So then when we read the caption, we realize that those are the people's refugees. They were waiting outside of the refugee camp in the early morning. And so they put on the blanket to keep off the chill. This photo also reminds me of another photo taken by Cartier-Bresson. So this photo, Cartier-Bresson took this photo in Kashmir, India. And again, Cartier-Bresson took this photo at the eye level. And I would say that Bresson, took this photo as more like a fine art photo rather than a photojournalistic photo.
Yeah.
So for me, I think, Salgado tend to prioritize form and beauty over the contents of the photo he took. To a certain extent, I think Edward Petinsky also, for some of his photos, he always took his photos. Most of his photos were taken, from the aerial view. Mm-hmm. And originally, he took helicopters to fly up in the sky, and then took photos from the sky of the rivers, mining, and oil field. Yeah. And I think he said something to the effect that the higher it is, the more abstract an image would be. Mm-hmm. And so this image come across as sort of like an abstract expressionist painting to me, together with this image as well. Mm-hmm. But then the river could have been polluted, and from this image, because it's so beautiful, and also he printed a very large size, image. So it come across as create a feeling of being very awesome, image, and also aesthetically it's very beautiful. And later he used a drone to create his image. Recently, this is one of the images I think he created using drone. Again, he also brought it up very big, but then we don't really see human beings, in his photo. But again, Stephen Shore, for his latest series of work, he also used drone, excuse me, to create this bodies of work, which is called topographies, as you know. But he took it from mostly 45 degree, and he used drone as if he raised up his large format camera, which he usually used. Of course, this one was taken by the camera attached to the drone, and we can see the landscape, social and cultural landscape in U.S. in this country, which is the subject matter, as you know, of Stephen Shore for most of his life. And he also took photos of the outskirts of cities, urban areas, with the dumping grounds of the used cars, and then there is some developments of housings beyond the highway. And he also took photo of this deserted house in a very vast, landscape. So for Stephen Shore, this is fine art photo. But then I'm not sure about Salgado's photo being regarded as a fine art. Even though he used black and white photos, he seldom used color. Petinsky's photo, I would say he mostly regard his own photo as a fine art, even though the photo has some photojournalism, elements in it. So my question to you is that do you agree with my assumption that these two photographers, they tend to prioritize form and the beauties over the contents of their photos? Thank you.
No, I absolutely disagree with that. Although I'm familiar with the argument, of course. Let's have the images back on the screen from the beginning. So the argument is that a quote unquote documentary photographer or photojournalist must be careful not to, how did you put it, aestheticize their images. And then you went from Salgado to the photograph of a sculpture of the Virgin Mary, and then you went to Walker Evans. Let's go to Walker Evans. Can you click on the Walker Evans? The argument about beautifying or aestheticizing is really dependent on whether you find it beautiful or not, right? If I said to you, I find the Evans really beautiful, and I also find it very painterly because it resembles Russian icon painting, not Renaissance extravagance or chiaroscuro lighting from Caravaggio or something, which you see in that first. You see how quickly the argument starts to fall apart. Every photograph is potentially an artwork and a document. It largely depends on how it's used. Now, you have shown us these images on white backgrounds, isolated. So which has more of a relation to the gallery wall and the fine art book than it does to, let's say, the pages of a newspaper or a photojournalistic website. I can well imagine a context, and I've seen these Salgado's pictures in photojournalistic context, in New York Times or the Sunday Times or wherever it might be, where the emphasis is on the documentary and the journalistic value and content of the pictures. Any photograph can be removed from that context and positioned somewhere else, and the response is likely to be more aesthetic, right? I personally do find the Evans more beautiful than the Salgado. So the whole argument that people make around certain photographers aestheticizing things that they shouldn't be aestheticizing, all that tells me is they find that beautiful. And they have a problem in finding it beautiful. And I get that. That's kind of built into photography. But I don't think Evans's picture is any more or less aestheticizing, more or less painterly than Salgado's. Depends what kind of painting you're looking at, frankly. What kind of painting you're thinking about. And I've seen that Evans picked this picture used in very journalistic contexts. I've seen it used in fine art contexts. But even if it's in a fine art context, it still has a very complex documentary value, because that is built into photography. All photographs are potentially artworks and potentially documents. That we know this. We know this. So I'm familiar with the argument that you make, Ron, although the way you make it, I don't think even you are completely convinced by it. I don't, I can, if you go to Stephen Shaw's drone pictures, I can imagine these being used in a report by a social geographer or a real estate developer, right? And that's fine. And Stephen knows that too. That is the ambiguity of photography. No fine art photographer, quote unquote, is completely that. If they're using photography, there is always going to be some kind of documentary dimension to what they're doing. Always. Even Jeff Wall. Jeff Wall's picture of the guy cleaning is also a fantastic document of the Barcelona Pavilion by Mies van der Rohe. Walker Evans, interestingly, was asked what makes a great photograph. And his reply, and I think he was only being a little ironic, his reply was 30 years. Wait 30 years. So if you go to the Bertinsky pictures, numbers 17, 18, for example, I just curated a Bertinsky exhibition. It's just finished at ICP here in New York. And the reason I wanted to do it was because the International Center for Photography, ICP, has had a kind of commitment from its very beginnings to concerned photography, so socially concerned, politically concerned photography. And I made an effort in that exhibition in the way that I wrote the little captions for each of the images to stress the social, industrial, economic, and political context of what you're looking at in the pictures. It's true, Bertinsky has had other exhibitions in which the emphasis has been on form, abstraction, looking like a Jackson Pollock. Yeah, I get it. That's kind of obvious. But they are also of real things in the world that can be looked at and thought about. Coming back to a point I made at the very beginning about scale, Bertinsky prints his photographs large enough so that you can walk towards them and look at all of that worldly detail. And when you go in and you look at that detail, it's not the same as looking at brushstrokes in a Jackson Pollock painting. It clearly isn't. It's a description of the world, right? Made in a certain kind of way. So again, any photograph is potentially an artwork and potentially a document. And I said to Bertinsky that this show is going to be political. It's going to really engage with what we're looking at, how it fits into the global economy, how it fits into the ecological crisis. It's true. I could have said, wow, look at this picture. Doesn't it look like an abstract expressionist painting? Yeah, of course it does. Because a lot of the world looks like an abstract. If I stare down at the desk in front of me, it looks like an abstract painting. Of course, that's just it's there are patterns in Bertinsky's work, but those are largely either the patterns of nature or they are the patterns of industrialization. It doesn't mean that there's a kind of using of the world simply to make an aesthetic experience. Photographs are way more complicated than that. I think sometimes there's a kind of easy criticism to make where someone decides to dismiss something on the basis of its aesthetic dimension or its beauty. But as I said before, all that tells me is that they think that that's beautiful. I don't find this Bertinsky picture particularly beautiful at all. I'm not, I just don't. So I don't think he's trying to trick me with his beauty, because I don't find it very beautiful, So I get the argument you're making wrong, but I think if people stop and think about that argument like for another 2 minutes, it starts to fall apart, and we're actually left with a far more complex and interesting set of challenges. Sorry to disagree on that point, but
thank you. Actually, David, I really like your answer, and really make me think to look at Salgado and Bertinsky's photos again. I really need to do so after today's presentation and discussion. But thank you. I think we should give the chance for Guosen to raise his question, his final question as well. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, okay. Thank you to the moderator Dante and also John for the really inspiring question, the presentation about suffering or atrocity photographs. Yeah, so I've got a question that's quite closely related to what John brought up earlier, basically because it's about how the whole relationship between art and non-art or between the canonical and the non-canonical actually plays out, in your writing or curating practice. Because in the opening part of your talk today, just after you introduced on photographs, yeah, I remember you brought up the issue of canonization, and you also said you are really not interested in instructing people how to understand a photograph. You rather write and think as someone who's just interested. Yeah, which I completely get. Yeah, but I'm quite curious how that attitude mm, actually shows up in what you do, like in your writing, in your curating. Because in your earlier conversation with John Rong, you said quite clearly that the power of photographs and photography lies in the fact that it can never be fully accepted as art or something non-art, that is always has one foot in and one foot out. And you say that kind of ambiguous position is the real source of its vitality, which is a really good way to put it. But then, as a creative director at ICP, one of your main job is, well, to bring certain bodies of photographic work into the institution's view, to maybe to canonize them, maybe even aestheticize them. I mean, through exhibitions, collections, or publications, all that. After all, putting a photograph on a gallery wall and putting it in a magazine are two completely different things in terms of how we come to understand it. Yeah, you mentioned that example earlier when responding to general. Yeah, but if we still need the white cube to carry out that task, then how is that actually possible? I mean, wouldn't it possible or wouldn't it require some kind of broader transformation or more fundamental change in the museum system itself? So I'm really curious, how do you personally reconcile those two positions? That means on one hand, there's your belief as curator or writer in photography's fluidity and its a stubborn way of standing up to being fully absorbed into art. And on the other hand, there's your uh there's your role inside an institution that's inevitably about giving photography a kind of, maybe it belongs to artistic status or maybe not, but maybe we can make this I think maybe make it a bit more concrete with an example, since we all just talked about work Evans. So I would like, yeah, let's talk about him a bit more. Yeah, I know you published a book around 2014, Walk Evans, the magazine, that places, yeah, the magazine work, yeah. Walk Evans is without doubt already canonized in the history of photography, in the history of art. A lot of photographers share that kind of status. They made it into big art history textbooks. For example, something like Art Since 19,000, by Rosalind Krauss and Halfos and so on. So I wonder if we want to make this question a bit more concrete, maybe by looking this specific example. How did you deal with Evans' canonical position when you were working on that project, and when this process of canonizing and decanonizing happens within the field of photography itself, how effective is it really? So the question really is about just the problem lie in the fact that we don't quite know how to decently or properly approach these photographs, approach photography, how to deal with the question of photography's artistic nature, or is it more to do with a broader institutional convention that exists beyond the photography but also includes it? So
Yeah.
I'm curious how you personally deal with that. Thank you. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
great. Right. No, I face these questions all the time. My feeling is that institutional spaces that are dedicated to photography, let's say the International Centre of Photography, where I'm the creative director, or the Photographers Gallery in London, or well, let's just leave it at those two, is that they are photography spaces, right? They are spaces that are part of culture, but also slightly set aside from it. And that, yes, sometimes they can be art spaces. You know, you talked about the white cube, and you kind of implied that if anything entered the gallery space, it would automatically be art and automatically be canonized as art. And I disagree with that. I think the real excitement and the real value of these kinds of photography institutions is that they can be art spaces, but they can be simply spaces to which we can bring different kinds of photography for careful reconsideration. You can make an exhibition that explores books. You can make an exhibition that explores scientific imagery. Doesn't mean you've turned it into art as soon as you've brought it into the gallery space. It's not Tate Modern. It's not the Museum of Modern Art. It's a photography space in all of that complexity. So I don't feel that anything that comes through the doors and is exhibited is immediately canonized and given some elevated value. I've made exhibitions where in the same space, well, let's bring the things together that you just talked about. There's a very interesting space institution in Paris called Le Bal, set up in 2010. And it originally, the intention was it was a space to look at the document in a kind of photographic document in a kind of expanded sense. And I was the co-curator of the first exhibition there, which was called Anonyme, Unnamed America in Photography and Film. And it was about the depiction of anonymous citizens, particularly in US, North American culture. And for me and the co-curator, a woman called Deanne Dufour, the two most important works for that show, which were really there at the beginning of our thinking, was, yes, a piece made for Fortune magazine in 1946 by Walker Evans. It's just a feature called Labor Anonymous, where he stood in one spot and photographed people as they came past his camera. And the other one was a very, very large black and white photograph framed. It weighs 460 kilos by Jeff Wall, called Men Waiting, picture of men waiting for work, waiting to be picked up for daily work. And they were in the same space, very close to each other. A magazine that I bought for $12 and a piece of contemporary art. Same subject matter, different historical moments. But as a photography space, you can bring these things together. I wasn't attempting to canonize the pages of this magazine. Neither was I trying to diminish the artistic significance of the Jeff Wall photograph. I was simply saying, let's think about these things together. This is a space where we can think about these things together. Yes, it was very expensive to ship the Jeff Wall picture from Los Angeles, whereas I arrived with the 70-year-old magazine in my bag, which I bought on eBay. But we have to understand that in our culture, and I'm sure you're finding this in China, there's a hierarchy in culture that puts museums up here and galleries here and books here and magazines here and websites down here and record covers or whatever it is. But we know that the important work in photography gets made in all of these different contexts. If you take the magazine page seriously, you do something, you have an audience for it, that can be as important or as significant as, I don't know, something made directly for a museum wall. That's photography for you. It does this. It's a very complicated thing. And the importance of photography institutions is they allow us to explore these questions in really interesting ways if we're intelligent and playful about it. It's not just the institution gives the artistic stamp of approval to whatever is put on the wall. I don't care about that. It's true that things get canonized, yeah. And in fact, I'm doing a show coming up quite soon in January about how things get canonized, why one photographer's work, how does it become significant? Is it just in the pictures? What else has to happen? And the example I'm taking is the French photographer Eugene Adjay. And Adjay, worked on his own as as a photographer making pictures for all kinds of different people for different reasons, including for the sheer pleasure of making them. But he wasn't very well known when he died in 1927. But when he died, the young photographer Bernice Abbott managed to buy, with some help, a large amount of Adjay's work, the glass plate negatives, the prints, several thousand, a big body of work. And she went about promoting his work, getting it published in different journals and magazines where different writers would write essays. Was he a documentarist? Was he an artist? Was he a surrealist? Was he a modernist? And over the 2 or 3 years after he died, Adjay's reputation really grew, particularly within the emerging world of modern photographic art. So that when the first book of Adjay's work was published in 1930, it just said Adjay on the cover, like he was a name, like there was a kind of mystique. But it was really Bernice Abbott who dedicated herself to the promotion of Ajay's work. And I'll make a show about what she did, how it's called Ajay, the Making of a Reputation. And we get to see the photographs, but I will also include all of the magazines that published his work between when he died in 1927 and when the first book came out in 1930. And you can see in real time, over 1,000 days, his reputation forming. It's fascinating. It's really interesting. I'm aware that there are many photographers who get completely overlooked. Their work does not get seen. Every photographer needs a champion, someone to take up their cause and get behind it. And I don't like the word promote, but speak on behalf of it, maybe. And I've done this for a lot for younger photographers who I thought were going to slip into obscurity. And, I try to do what I can. And then when I make shows about big canonical names, I try to make them as interesting as I possibly can. But to come back to your original point, I don't think I think photography spaces, photography galleries are places simply to look again and think again at all the different kinds of photography. On the magazine, the Walker Evans magazine work, well, that was an interesting case. I'm just seeing if I've got my copy of the book here. No, I haven't. Yes, he had become particularly since his death, a very famous name in history of photography. I never thought that his magazine work was taken as seriously as he took it. And I got very fascinated with it. And, Evans he was a photographer who could have had a lot more exhibitions in his lifetime than he did. He didn't have that many. They were important, but there weren't that many. But he did take the pages of magazines very, very seriously, and where he would decide what to photograph, go photograph it, do the editing, do the layout, write the text, consider the typography, everything. So they are really his pages. The good ones are really his pages. And I thought they had not been taken seriously because culture doesn't take magazines seriously. It thinks, you throw them away at the end of the month when the next one appears, right? But very good work does get made for magazines. I'm always interested in the difference between a book and a magazine, because we think of books as this important the space of canonization. If you throw away a book, if you put it in the trash, people think you're destroying culture, you're a fascist or something. But people throw magazines away all the time. What's the difference? The binding? The advertising pages? What's the, it's a crazy situation in a way. I'm fascinated by it. But yeah, I was interested in drawing attention to Evans's magazine work. And that meant a lot of work finding all of those magazines because he was active for 50 years and taking it to a publisher where we reproduced all of his pages, not just the images, but everything, the pages where you can read the text and see the layout. Because I thought it was worth looking at, It wasn't turning it into art. It's just saying, let's look again at this. It's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So
carry on.
yeah. Have you done? Yeah, okay, yeah, thank you for your response. Yeah, I'm really impressed by how precisely you handle the specifics of history. Yeah, I totally agree with you. Because when I was asking my question just now, I found I definitely fell into a kind of habitual way of thinking about what a museum is or what a museum should be. Yeah, I had an unfair assumption about what a photography space should be. I felt that maybe what you are doing in your practice for me is actually trying to preserving photography's diversity and its sense of possibility. And that to me is far more valuable than simply defending or rejecting photography's artistic status. Yeah, I completely agree with what you just said. Yeah, thank you again. Thank you again.
Pleasure. Very good question.
好的，这个我觉得刚才这个讨论呢，非常的有意思。它涉及到一个什么问题呢？涉及到一个到底什么是艺术的问题。这个我前几天刚写一篇文章，里面就提到这个观点。我说什么是艺术这个问题是没有答案的，是不可解的。这个问题实际上是一个不能被回答的。但是我觉得更应该思考的是什么呢？叫何时成为艺术，才是一个更重要的、值得我们思考的问题。就像刚才这个卡帕尼老师讲的，就是说一张照片，对，它在一个杂志上，在一本书里和在一个这个展厅里，对吧？这是不一样的。但这还不是最重要的。最重要，因为这个是我们惯性思维嘛。更重要的是什么呢？它在某一个那个场域，以及某一个特定的语境和那个特定的时间、那个历史的时刻里，它会成为艺术。在不是这个时刻里头呢，它可能就是一张照片。但是呢，这个照片里头它具有成为艺术的潜质，但并不等于它就是艺术。所以在那篇文章里，实际我没有举摄影的例子，我是提到了，前不久我们在那个蕉岭那个大地艺术季里头的一个刘耀华的作品，就是他呢就是弄了就这么几个字，叫“微风你好啊，我是涟漪”。这样的一个用泡沫塑料做的字，无论放在哪个里面，它都不是艺术，它顶多是一个说把一个诗句是吧，有点诗意的这么一个东西，这个做成这么一段文字。但是当他把这样一种文字搁到了蕉岭的那个河流里的时候，瞬间它就成为艺术，在那一时刻成为艺术。为什么呢？整个那个，因为它那个字飘在那个水波上，就仿佛那个大河在开口。说话一样，说他在跟微风打的招呼，说你好啊，微风你好啊，我是涟漪。所以这个我就想到了霍金的一句话，他说不是这个你在观看大自然，是大自然在借助人类的意识反观自身。对，这个作品立刻就。它就让我们整个的一条河都变成了一条流淌的诗。我说在这一个时刻，它成为了艺术。当你把那行字从这个河里再捞出来，再摆在一个其他地方，它又不是艺术了。对，所以这个是非常奇妙的。所以艺术呢，这个是何时成为艺术？用我们中国的话来讲，可以说是一个造化的时刻。对，是一个造化的，不是完全是人力可为的。对，它既有人的这种主观的这种所谓的意图，但更多的是一种非常的这个具有偶发的这种东西。对，所以呢，这个这是我对刚才的讨论的一个我个人的一个观点。那么今天的这个讨论呢，非常的这个好，非常的热烈，对，有这个有争论，有这个对，在这个讨论一些非常重要的问题，而且呢，这个卡帕尼老师呢，据我所知，在2027年曾经在中国居住过一段，在这个厦门。尤其在跟厦门大学这个做的那些个学术活动，所以呢，我呢特别的希望坎帕尼老师呢将来一定要再来中国。再来中国的时候呢，我们可以不是这样的线上的，就像去年跟这个肖尔一样，我们坐在一起面对面的这个讨论，就更加的有一种精神上的沟通。对，所以呢，我们这个非常期待坎帕尼老师再次到中国来， 再次坐到我们的身边啊，我们在一起畅谈这个关于摄影何时会变成艺术的问题。好，那么今天这个讨论的非常的好啊，这个感谢这个卡帕尼老师，感谢这个姜荣老师、郭森老师，和我们的静怡老师，还有这个每次给我们做幕后英雄的这个对给我们做技术支持的这个史阳坤老师，当然我们更要感谢今天收看我们这个直播的广大的这个听众朋友。好，那么这个今天的讨论呢是非常的圆满，非常的丰富。对，好，那么我们今天的讨论就到这里。好，谢谢大家。好。
Great.
Thank
Thanks
you.
very much, everyone. Bye bye.
Thank you, David. It's really great to have you for 3 hours. It's really, it's too much for you, but
Oh, wow.
we really
3
enjoyed
hours.
it.
Oh, I'm so
We
sorry.
really enjoyed it. No, we really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
感谢各位老师的精彩分享，也感谢大家的用心聆听。本期服务器艺术、当代影像、路径及其可能第15期如何读懂一幅摄影作品线上论坛圆满结束，也非常感谢各院校机构和媒体的大力支持与参与。我们期待下次再见，谢谢。